Yeah. Dr. Nagaratna?
Hello, sir. Yeah, I'm here.
Ma'am. Yeah. Welcome, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Good evening.
We would start by 4:30. Yes, ma'am. Perfect, ma'am. We will start 4:30 sharp, ma'am.
Sure.
Richard, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Shall we start?
Yes, ma'am. 4:30, no, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Please start.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the final day of the All India Educators Meet. And the theme of the day is Leadership in Times of Uncertainty. Let us begin the session with a moment of silent prayer. Thank you. Let me begin by welcoming all of you to this session. Today, we have with us our esteemed resource person, Dr. Nagaratna A., Associate Professor of Law and Chief Coordinator of Advanced Center on Research, Development and Training in Cyber Laws and Forensics, National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. Ma'am, we are very happy to have you here amidst us on behalf of the entire Kristu Jayanti fraternity and on behalf of all the educational leaders gathered here. I extend a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I extend a very warm welcome to the most reverend bishops, the provincials, the educational secretaries of various congregations, the principals and teachers of prestigious educational institutions who are attending this program. Warm welcome, dear delegates. I extend a warm welcome to our principal, members of the management team, the entire organizing team of the meet, and my fellow faculty members who are part of the meet. Hearty welcome to all. Technical session 6 is on policies and legal components towards safe school. Let me introduce the resource person for the session, Dr. Nagaratna A. Ma'am holds a PhD in medical negligence law and is pursuing her postdoctorate study in cybercrime investigation and prosecution. Her areas of interest and research includes criminal laws, cyber laws, and medical laws. She was awarded many international fellowships and has contributed to the state's policies and practices of India in many capacities. She's a prolific author with many books to her credit. Currently, Dr. Nagaratna A. is the Associate Professor of Law and Chief Coordinator of Advanced Center on Research, Development and Training in Cyber Laws and Forensics, National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. We all believe in rule of law as a foundation for all our basic rights, and it is every child's right to have an education rendered in a safe environment. On that note, I request you, ma'am, to take over the session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Yeah. Are the PowerPoint visible, the slides visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you. A very good evening to all. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me, especially on this extremely important issue, which is about safety of children, which in fact should be the paramount concern of institutions like school, where children spend maximum time, except that during COVID, we've had a different situation, but when a child is in the school, so the child's right to safety becomes the most important concern. So since it's a very comprehensive issue, there are many policies, I'll try to address the whole issue through certain legal provisions and principles because of paucity of time. So as Pandit Nehru had said, children are like buds in a garden and should be carefully and lovingly nurtured as they are future of the nation and citizens of tomorrow. So what we build in today, in fact, would result in our tomorrow's future. And because it's all about children, so they definitely deserve the care and protection. As was also said by William Clinton, there is nothing more precious to a parent than a child. And in fact, legally, teachers are also seen as being in the place of parents. So it's not just biological parents. It's not just about the relatives in the family who would be concerned about child's interest and safety. So it's also about those who take this particular position in the school. So coming back to the code, he further says that nothing is more important to our future than the safety of all our children. So that's the concern of safety of children. To ensure that a child is safe in this school atmosphere, we have number of laws, some which directly addresses this particular aspect of safety of children, some which are general but then have specific provisions in relation to children's safety. Apart from law, we do have a lot of policies, and depending upon the board to which a particular school belongs, you may also have a lot of guidelines, notifications, circulars issued by the boards. But largely all of this focuses on one and the only aspect, that is about safety of the children. So therefore, as I said earlier, I would focus more on the principles and provisions rather than go into each and every policies. Now, why do we firstly why are we supposed to even follow these in a particular law framework? So is it just about this safety? Is it just about this future of our nation and all? So it's definitely about this, which is in fact, as I said earlier, paramount concern. But it's also about showing adherence to what law requires us to follow as schools, as management, as teachers, as the one in whose control and care, in whose custody, in fact, not just control, in whose custody the children are. So therefore, it is all about showing our compliance to legal requirements. And these legal requirements comes in form of international law, national law, state level law. That is, for example, Karnataka state or say Maharashtra, like that. So you may come across a lot of laws at the national, international, as well as state level. And many times it can also be specific to a local area. So a local, education department or officer can also come with his or her own circular. So when I say law, it would include all of this. But focusing on the most important part of these laws, international legal instruments, most importantly, includes firstly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is all about protection of human rights of everyone, every human being, including children. So it's not specific to child. So I'll not go into the details of it. But the other one is extremely important. That is UN's Convention on Rights of Children. The UN Convention on Rights of Children obligates state to take care of each and every right of children, including right to education. And over there, you can in fact see that this is implicit also to include safety concerns of children. Most importantly, UNCRC's impact today in India, we can see it in form of having a lot of laws that are undergoing changes. It can include laws which talks about punishments which are imposed upon children who commit offenses. That is, I'm not talking about corporal punishment, it's about punishment imposed by the courts. So there also you have a lot of restrictions, as well as the law which tries to protect children against sexual offenses. So on these lines, we've seen a lot of amendments happening in the domain of the law. All these are because of UNCRC, that is United Nations Convention on Child Rights. Most important for us, which is relevant to the theme that we're today discussing, is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This particular international law or legal instrument imposes obligation on state members, that is nations, to recognize fundamental right to education. Maybe today you have Article 21A, which talks about fundamental right to education. But even before we brought into 21A into our constitution, we already had this particular international convention, which required nations, including India, to in fact recognize right to education as a fundamental right. Now, since most of the participants are not from law background, so just focus on certain fundamental issues. What is the implication of calling a right as a fundamental right? When we call a right as a fundamental right, this means that these rights cannot be taken away even by the state, unless state has reasonable grounds to restrict our enjoyment of right. Our right, especially fundamental rights, cannot be taken away. Even if it is taken away by state, I can initiate legal action against state. Some of the examples of fundamental rights includes right to life, right to freedom of speech and expression. And here it is all about right to education. Now, this convention also requires the state to ensure that there is full development of human personality and dignity of a child, which is achieved through education. And further, there is obligation on the state to strengthen respect for human rights and freedoms of everyone, including children. So here, the state is also required to provide free and compulsory primary education, as well as progressively introduce free education at the secondary level. Why do they say progressively? So you cannot like over a night make all this education at every level free. So it just progressively go towards where it becomes easily accessible to everyone. This convention indirectly also recognizes rights of parents to send their children to schools other than those which are run by the state. Today we see it in form of the RTE law. Coming to Indian laws, Indian constitution, again, as I just mentioned incidentally, guarantees certain fundamental rights to all of us, including right to life. And right to life includes right to dignity and liberty. So when we talk about dignity, so it also talks about having this in place, even in places of learning. So the way we treat a child and all is all about right to life, right to liberty, right to dignity and all. In addition to this, every one of us have fundamental right to freedom of movement, freedom of trade, freedom of expression and speech. So like this, there are many rights which are conferred upon each one of us, including children under the constitution. Of course, when it comes to children, the way we implement might become a little different because they're children. Apart from constitutional law, we also have civil laws as well as criminal laws. Again, basically, very briefly about the difference between civil and criminal law. Suppose I commit a wrong, which is a civil wrong, and if a civil case is filed against me, the court will ask me to pay compensation, that is monetary compensation, usually. But if I commit a crime and if a case is filed under criminal law, the court will in fact subject me to, if at all they find me guilty, the court can subject me to imprisonment, fine, or even death sentence, so depending upon the seriousness of the punishment. So therefore, if it is civil law, it means that the wrongdoer will be asked to pay compensation. If it is criminal law, the wrongdoer will be subjected to punishments such as imprisonment or even something more harsher than that, depending upon the nature of wrong committed by the person. Now coming to the whole aspect of safety in the school. So why is this important? The guidelines which was issued by the Ministry of HRD in the year 2014 on safety and security of children, in fact, recognizes that children require a healthy and supportive environment to grow and develop and have access to education in an environment that is safe, protective, and conducive to the growth and development. The school environment is associated with not just providing education as per this guideline, it's associated with providing overall growth and development, cognitive behavior, safety and security of children. So therefore, when we talk about safety of a child, it's a very comprehensive term. It's an all-inclusive concept, and it's not just about ensuring physical safety, it's even more than that. Coming to other legal aspects. In fact, the same guidelines of MHRD do recognize this legal provision. So it refers to Article 21, which I just mentioned, as one of the fundamental rights guaranteed to each one of us by the Indian Constitution. So no one can take away my right to life, liberty, and dignity without a procedure established by law, which means the right to life and liberty, like which includes right to liberty, indicates that I cannot be unnecessarily arrested and all. However, if police are arresting, it should be as per the process established by law. So same, explanation applies even in relation to right to life of every person. It cannot be taken away unless there is a procedure established by law, and that procedure should be just and fair. So coming to the next most important fundamental right, Article 21A, which was inserted into the Constitution just few years back, states that state should provide free and compulsory education to all children of the age between 6 to 14, which means primary education. And maybe later it is all a part of directions issued by the Constitution, but not a mandatory obligation. So this is something that becomes fundamental because state should provide this. There's no other option for the state but to provide this. Now, to ensure that Article 21 is implemented, Government of India passed Right to Education Act in the year 2009. In addition to this, we have many other rights, including right to privacy law, which I'll come little later. So this is about fundamental rights, which is a part of Constitution. The same Constitution also has another part called Directive Principles of State Policy. Now, Chapter 3 of the Constitution is about fundamental rights. Chapter 4 is about directive principles. So what is the difference between the two? Both are in the Constitution. Directive principles are just directions issued to the state by the Constitution, saying that as much as possible, you follow in this direction, you go towards this direction. If you're not able to follow, it's okay, you can't be punished. But fundamental rights are such that state should provide it. If state fails to provide it, I can file a case on this state. Right? So coming to directive principles, Article 39E says that state should try to ensure that the children, especially in their tender age, are not abused. So means you come up with laws, policies of such a nature that you prevent abuse of children. Further, to add to this, we have Article 39F, which says state should work progressively towards ensuring that children are given opportunities and facilities to develop in a healthy manner and in conditions of freedom and dignity, and that childhood and youth are protected against exploitation and against moral and material abandonment. So these are directions towards which state is striving to achieve these objectives or principles, for which we have multiple laws. Now, coming to certain issues relating to child safety. So one usual concern when we see it as a parent or from the child perspective is about corporal punishments. Are these allowed? Especially in a country like India, it's a dilemma because our social factors, cultural factors are different. We usually see disciplining as our right. I'm not talking about imposing severe extent of corporal punishment, but when we are like, cautioning a child, scolding a child and all, it is all most often done in good faith. But are laws allowing this? So let's see the extent to which law allows this or doesn't allow this. The Juvenile Justice Act of 2015 defines corporal punishment as subjecting of a toddler by a person to physical punishment, which involves the deliberate infliction of pain as a penalty for an offense or to discipline or reform a child. So I'm punishing child maybe because my intention is to discipline the child. My intention is to reform the child. My intention is to just impose a punishment on the child because the child has done an offense. So is this allowed? The same JJ Act under Section 23 says, whoever who has actual charge of or control over a child or a juvenile. So somebody who is in my control, who is in my custody, for example, observation homes, remand homes, hostels, right? So these are children who are in my control. If I assault or abandon or expose or willfully neglect such juvenile means a child who is not completed 18 years of age, or if I cause or procure him to be assaulted, I get it done through NADA. I don't do it, I ask A to assault the child. Or I get it done through NADA, that is, I get the child abandoned, exposed, or neglected in a manner likely to cause such juvenile or child unnecessary mental or physical suffering, shall be punishable with imprisonment up to so and so period and fine. So we can see that JJ Act very clearly talks about corporal punishment being a criminal offense because the punishment over here is imprisonment. In addition to JJ Act, we have RTE Act, that is Right to Education Act, which indirectly also tries to prevent corporal punishment. Now, under this particular enactment, corporal punishment can be classified into three categories. Physical punishment, so it's not just about physically beating. If you look at the later on inclusion, it includes mental harassment, so that is putting psychological pressure on the child. And lastly, but extremely important one is a discriminating child, because this will also have its own impact on the child, its growth, etc. So this is also treated as a form of corporal punishment. Section 17 of the RTE Act clearly prohibits any sort of physical punishment and mental harassment to a child, because it says that no child should be subjected to any physical punishment. If at all I do that as a teacher, as a staff, whatever is my capacity, so I can be subjected to disciplinary action under service rule. So this is not a criminal offense under Section 17. So under Section 17, okay, maybe you will be subjected to criminal punishment also, but in addition, I can be subjected to, say, internal disciplinary inquiry as per applicable service rules. So which are different for government institutions, different for private institutions, etc. In addition to this, this act also under Section 8 and 9 obligates government and the government agencies to ensure that child, especially the one who is belonging to a weaker section, who come from backward communities, etc., and also child belonging to disadvantaged groups, are not discriminated against and are not prevented from pursuing or completing elementary education on any ground. So you cannot indirectly deny the child his right to education. So that's about RTE Act and GGL. Now coming to the most relevant law, apart from education specific law from the criminal domain, it is Indian Penal Code. Now why is Indian Penal Code relevant? Indian Penal Code of 1860 is in fact one of the vast criminal law we have in our country. So it's very, very relevant, because when, if at all I'm punishing a child that results in any, say, injury to the child, etc., that injury can become an offense under IPC. So various sections under Indian Penal Code or IPC. So if whatever I've done amounts to an offense, IPC will also apply. In addition to this, IPC is also important because it talks about grounds of exceptions. Now, what if whatever I've done on a child is done in good faith, is done with the consent of child or child's parents? Am I excused from the criminal liability? So is what is also indicated in IPC. So for these two reasons, IPC is important. Some of the offenses which might be relevant for the issue that we're talking about are these: using criminal force or assaulting a child is an offense. So what is criminal force? So basically using that physical force, like, maybe shaking the child, or like, forcefully making the child move, or even like slapping, all these comes technically under the definition of criminal force. Or assaulting a child, etc., comes under Indian Penal Code, and these are specific offenses for which various forms of punishments are prescribed, depending upon, while using criminal force, what injury I've caused, etc., with what intention, etc. Various offenses are made out. For example, if criminal force is used against a girl child in such a manner that it outrages modesty of that particular child, girl child, so we can apply sections like 354 of IPC, which is about outraging modesty of women. So therefore, depending upon different situation, different sections of IPC will apply. Then comes the offense of hurt. What is hurt? Legally, there is a different meaning. Maybe for a common man, hurt would mean causing any kind of pain, but legally hurt means causing any pain or infirmity or disease. Means it is not just limited to school kind of an atmosphere. Any place by any person, this can be committed. Basically, if I am knowingly or intentionally inflicting injury on a person, or if I'm causing pain to a person, for example, I drag a person with the hair, it causes pain. So it's nothing but an offense of hurt. Or I slap a person, it causes pain. So it's an offense of hurt. Or causing disease. For example, I know I'm COVID affected and I deliberately, go in public place without wearing mask with an intention of spreading this infection. So it's nothing but hurt technically under IPC. So that is hurt. So causing pain, infirmity, or disease. Infirmities, so maybe the extent of harassment I've put on a person is so much, or the act I've done is such that it has caused, say, infirmity of an organ of the body, or maybe because of mental stress, that person is unable to do something. So it also amounts to an offense of hurt because it causes infirmity. If hurt is of a severe nature, so then we call it as grievous hurt. For example, any hurt which is of such a nature that the victim, loses hearing ability, at least of one ear, or seeing ability, at least of one eyes, or there is defacement, or there is an offense of defacement, for example, acid attacks, or cutting the nose, anything like this. So defacement, or causing fractures. So like this, if the hurt is more serious, it becomes an offense of grievous hurt. Whoever causes hurt or grievous hurt is punishable under IPC. If it is done under provocation, also it's an offense. If it is done with dangerous weapons, also it's an offense. If it is done with, say, wooden stick, etc., Again, we have separate sections. So it all depends on how I've committed the offense, irrespective of who has committed. So all these are dealt with under IPC. What if, in order to discipline a child, I lock the child in a room? It is also an offense under IPC because IPC covers the offense of wrongful confinement and wrongful restraint. Now, legally, what is the difference between the two? Wrongful restraint means that I have restrained movement of a person in a particular way, but there's another way through which he can still come out or go in. So which means there are two doors to a classroom. I just lock one. The other is still open and people can come out and move from that other door. So that is wrongful restraint. If that person had right to use the first door, so despite having right, if I've stopped, so it's an offense. For example, this can happen in some apartments and all. So let's assume maybe because I've not paid the rent, the apartment owner, the office bearers have locked a particular gate, but I still have right over that particular gate to be used and all. So if you're locking it, it's wrongful restrainment. You can say there's another gate, you can use the other gate, but no, I still have a right to use this gate. So that's how we interpret the law. Unless you feel that non-payment of rent has taken away my right. So if that is the interpretation, then I lose the right. So that is wrongful restraint, where you still have another path to take. So wrongful confinement is where from every angle I'm confined. For example, it's not just one door. In a classroom, when you have two doors, you lock both, so it's wrongful confinement. Depending upon how long a person is confined, there are different sections. Punishment also increases if the period of detention, confinement increases. Up to 3 days, it's a particular punishment. Confinement of more than 3 days, it's a particular punishment. More than 10 days, much more is a punishment. So like that. So all these are independently recognized offenses. If I'm intimidating, scaring, terrorizing, insulting the child, so that's also an offense at IPC. It is covered under criminal intimidation. Suppose I do something with which the child gets so affected by whatever I've done or said that the child commits suicide. So then there is possibility of invoking law relating to abetment of suicide. However, over here, whatever I've done should amount to abetment. So what is abetment? Legally, abetment means that I should intentionally or knowingly abet the suicide of the other person. Abetment can be of two types: abetment to instigation, abetment by aiding, that is abetment by instigation, abetment by aiding, and abetment by conspiracy. So over here, I'm giving general understanding of the term. So in an educational institution scenario, it can be different. For example, let's assume few children subject another child to cyberbullying or just bullying. That other child gets so affected that the child commits suicide, which are the incidences we unfortunately keep hearing in actual reality. So can these children be punished? So whatever these children have done, we can call it as bullying. But then if it is of a nature, of such a nature that it can fall under the definition of abetment, that is intentionally or knowingly doing an act, knowing that he will end up he will commit suicide, then it's an offense. So therefore, I should have that state of mind to draw that person to commit suicide. So only then it becomes an offense. So otherwise, not every kind of differences in opinion or harassment can be termed as abetment to suicide. So otherwise, abetment can happen either by instigating someone, so inciting him to go and commit an offense, or it can happen by aiding, that is, I'm helping a person to go and commit an offense, or it can happen by conspiracy, that is, two or more than two people enter into a plan to commit an offense, so that is conspiracy. So all these are possible sections and IPC which are relevant to the safety of children. So like this, you might come across many other sections of IPC which might be relevant depending upon the circumstances of the case. Now, can I say that since I am, say, a teacher, or I'm like the one who's supposed to discipline the child, so my act of inflicting hurt or grievous hurt or assaulting or using criminal force, etc., or maybe I scold, but that child is so sensitive that that child attempts to commit suicide, etc., can I say whatever I did was only done with a good intention and all? So let's see what the law says. Section 88 of the IPC says that if an act is done, so if you see the content of the section, it says nothing which is not intended to cause death. See, I never intended to cause death. So therefore, it is not an offense by reason of any harm which it may cause, or may be intended by the doer to cause, or to be known by the doer to be likely to cause, to any person for whose benefit it is done in good faith. So I'm doing it in the benefit of child. So, and I'm doing it in good faith, not with any, say, bad intention, etc. So whatever I've done, if results in, say, some harm to the child, I'm not liable under Section 88, provided I was acting in good faith, and provided I had got consent to do this, say, from the concerned person. Maybe in this case, child cannot give consent, so the parents of children. So in that case, if the other person suffers harm, takes the risk of harm, etc., I am not responsible. Now, the general object of this section is to ensure that the acts of people, like doctors, etc., dentists, etc., is safeguarded against criminal liability. In the sense, tomorrow I can't say that my dentist inflicted pain on me while giving injection or while doing root canal treatment. So to avoid that, we have a section like this which says, okay, whatever he has done is with your consent. Maybe it is an implied consent or express consent also, and it was done only to ensure that you overcome a particular pain or a disease, and it was done only to only with good intention. So then whatever is done by the doctors, etc., is subject to immunity. That is, it is subject to exemption from criminal liability. So this is Section 88, which is usually applicable in a situation, as I said, like, say, maybe medical cases, etc., or maybe something like I'm saying that there is a fire accident and the fire is catching huts after the other in a village. So it is fastly spreading. In order to avoid further spread of the fire, I bring down a hut. In the sense, I'm destroying the house so that it doesn't further spread. Over here, I've done it in a good faith, so I shouldn't be liable. So something like that. So it's called like, necessity knows no law. So because it's necessity, it was done in good faith, I cannot be liable. Like 88, we have 89, which is more about, say, whatever is done in the benefit of child. So let's see this section. So it says, nothing which is done in good faith for the benefit of a person under 12 years of age, or a person of unsound mind, or by a person who has given consent, which is either express or implied, of the guardian or other person having lawful charge of that person. So instead of child, because child cannot give a valid consent, the parents have consented to me. So with that consent, so whatever I do is not an offense just because it causes any harm, but for this you have exceptions. This exception, that is the exemption from liability, will not apply if I've intentionally caused a death or if I've intentionally done an offense of attempt to cause death. This exemption will not apply if whatever I've done is done in such a manner that I know that it is likely to cause death. In the sense, it's a severe corporal punishment, so severe that any reasonable man can know that the consequence of it is death, or the consequence of it is a grievous hurt, or the consequence of it is causing grievous disease or infirmity. Then you will not get exemption. Thirdly, this exception will not extend to voluntarily in the sense knowingly, intentionally causing grievous hurt, or attempting to cause grievous hurt, etc. So all these are the exceptions. So otherwise, under Section 89, whatever is done in the interest of child with the consent of child's guardian is exempted from liability, but it doesn't mean that I can cause grievous hurt, etc. It doesn't mean that even when I'm abetting, I can be exempted. So that's two sections relevant in IPC, which is about exemptions. However, these sections in earlier days, so there are some old cases where court was saying, okay, teachers are excused under Section 88, 89 and all. But of recently, if you see last few years, courts are not using this section in favor of, say, children or educational institutions. They started saying that no, corporal punishment at any cost is not allowed. You cannot even get the protection of 88 and 89. So there is a change in the way we are interpreting these provisions in the atmosphere, like in the context of school atmosphere. So that's about like corporal punishment. There are other aspects which gets related to child safety. Now, suppose a child is subjected to sexual harassment or sexual assault, or if it's an offense of pornography. So maybe child pornography related pictures are made, uploaded, shared. So all these gets covered under another law called POCSO, or it is called as Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. Again, recently we've heard about certain incidents of children becoming victims of sexual assault in few schools and all. So let's see what is the law framework. The POCSO, which is a result of UNCRC, the Child Related Convention of the UN, mandated India and other state members to have a specific law to protect children against sexual offences. So that's the reason why in 2012, on November 14th, That is, on Children's Day, we passed this POCSO new enactment, the then new enactment. So this law has separate provisions under which sexual harassment, which also includes, say, verbal harassment, making some sound or words or gestures with sexual intent. So that is also recognized as an offense, as well as sexual assault. It can include even rape. In a sense, in legal terms, it's called penetrative sexual assault, non-penetrative sexual assault. So it's a very wider law. It also includes child pornography. And over here, even showing porn material to a child or recording, things related to child which results in pornography, all these are covered. So as I said, even showing these kind of contents to child is made out as an offense. And it is very, very wide, even to include offenses like possession of child porn material. So I have not committed any offense. I've just downloaded child porn material on my mobile phone. Having it in my mobile phone itself is an offense. So like this, it's a very strict law. This law is more relevant for, say, professionals like teachers and all, because this imposes obligation on any or every person to inform law enforcement agency about any information that you have in relation to a child getting subjected to sexual offense. For example, if I as a teacher get to know that a child in my class is being subjected to sexual abuse by somebody, I have a duty to inform the authorities. So duty to inform is a mandatory duty. Not performing this duty is a punishable offense under POCSO. So that's about sexual offenses and all. Now comes the other most important issue. Why is it important? Since we all know, since last 1 year, all our children are on cyberspace, including classes are run on cyberspace, etc. So it raises the question of cyber safety of children. So it's become a very crucial issue, because before COVID, maybe there were only few schools, especially those corporate schools, which were more keen on using ICT technology to teach children. We had schools where kids were allowed, in fact, asked to bring notepads and all. So it was like, just before COVID, it was like, some had access to technology, some did not have access to technology as children. But now, like, you are seeing an inevitable situation where everybody is supposed to use the technology. So much so that even in villages and all, we saw how like evening classes were run, because it was only in the evening that child could get access to mobile phone or internet, etc. So now it's all about teaching on online space. So when we're exposing them to this particular space, which is not foolproof against safety and security, there's a larger concern. For example, we've heard about incidences of child misusing this platform. Example, especially the teenage children, or like, little more higher age, like maybe in the +1, +2, so that immediately entering into college level. So you've seen like how kids, since they are not aware of the risk involved and all, keep sharing personal information. There have been incidences of children taking pictures of private parts of the body and sharing it with their friends, boyfriends and all. So many times this later gets misused, etc. So making them aware of all these issues is extremely important. May not be children of tender age, but we should see what is important for their specific age, etc. And accordingly, train them with safety measures, etc. So online classes, in fact, has raised many other concerns. We had incidences across the country, like which were reported, like some senior children were sending sexually abusive material to junior kids, or when the class is going on, children are having their own chat, etc. So it's all about monitoring, etc. But definitely not to that extent that we start doubting each and every child, or we start encroaching on privacy, etc. But of course, having a child safety policy which is inclusive of cyber safety has become the need of the day, because as I said, possibility of online abuse cannot be prevented. It's not just about safety in the school. Now, because of online classes, it's also about the child is at home, but he's on your platform where you're taking class. So it's an extension of school atmosphere to the house, where both are equally responsible as teachers and parents. So to ensure that child is safe, so it's a very comprehensive aspect. So we need to identify the concerns depending upon the age category of the child. Especially when children are on social media platform, etc. Now we're ourselves exposing them to say WhatsApp as a platform, etc. So it becomes a more complicated issue. We've had, as I mentioned, we've had incidences of cyberbullying that has even led to, say, committing of suicide by children and all. So therefore, it's more a sensitive issue. So over here, it becomes a very comprehensive issue. So because of paucity of time, I'll not go into the details. But when we talk about safety today, the situation is such that we should also consider cyber safety as a part of safety of children. Coming to another important concern is about, say, data protection or privacy of children. So especially in a school when you have a lot of data belonging to children, and some of those data are very sensitive. For example, maybe I have, say, details about child's blood group, medical history, etc. Of course, it's important to ensure that child is safer. So I might need immediate access to this kind of information. So I will ask them to provide this information during admission or update the same every year. So it's all fine. So collecting all this information is okay if you feel it's essential to administer the school and all, but transferring it to somebody else or sharing it with another person, etc., today gets covered under data protection law. So, however, law is not as of now very clear. If it's a government school and all, we have Article 21, because Article 21 is about right to life, which includes right to privacy. But if it is private schools, as of now, law is not very clear. But very soon, we will be having personal data protection law, which is as of now is available in form of bill. So once they implement the law, every school, whether you're government school or aided school or corporate school, whatever is the nature of the school that we are running, it will all fall under PDP bill, that is protection of the personal data protection bill. Now, under this bill, child-related personal information is very, very important. So, especially it's a common practice to see the publication of children's information, including their photograph, their name, their class, their age, along with the percentage of child. When the child has scored good marks and all. Maybe tomorrow all that will get affected once personal data protection bill comes in. Coming to other aspects, the campus is also supposed to be very, very safe. So over here, we may not have direct provisions in IPC, but suppose, let's assume the drinking water I'm giving to school is not hygiene, is not clean. And because of that, the child suffers, say, food poisoning, something like that. So we have sections in IPC which talks about negligent act, to which somebody gets exposed to harm. So it's possible to invoke those provisions. So when we talk about health and hygiene and all, of course, you will have, say, ICSE board guidelines, CBSE board guidelines, state board guidelines. So all those guidelines might be there, policies might be there. But tomorrow, if the matter becomes so serious that it results in an offense, we do have IPC which can take care of the concern. So when we talk about health and hygiene, again, another vast category of issues will come under this, including, say, the hygienity that we maintain in the food that we provide, especially the schools which provide, say, midday meals, or the schools which have canteens and all. So it's our responsibility to ensure that the food provided is safe, clean, and all that. Secondly, same applies even with regard to drinking water, the toilet facilities, the staircases, the lifts. So everywhere, we are supposed to ensure that it is child-friendly, etc. So what happens, suppose there is an accident or child suffers some, say, injury, maybe while using a staircase or while using a lift and all. I'm not saying every injury we are answerable or not answerable. So it all depends on whether you could foresee that risk or not. Anything that I do where I foresee a risk, so there is possibility of imposing criminal liability. So where I can foresee the risk means I know that this can happen. I know that if I wash the staircase when children are entering the school, it's risky. I shouldn't be letting that happen. So, but I'm like not careful about it. So then a child slips and falls. So I can be liable under criminal law. So this is one aspect. The second aspect is about just exposing children to all these kind of, say, injury, harm, etc. Can also be a ground on which civil cases can be filed, because assault is also a civil offense. So like that, sometimes civil case can also be filed. In a sense, it all depends on what the victim wants. If the victim wants compensation, civil case can also be filed. When we talk about safety of children, it's also about ensuring the safety of the child. When the child is, maybe traveling from school to house to school, in the school bus, or even when we take children to field visits or tours, excursions, etc. So our duty extends till then. It just doesn't stop within the campus. Similarly, when children start, say, exposing other child to, say, things which are not safe for the child, for example, eve teasing between children, ragging between children, cyber bullying between children, etc. So though it is children who are themselves committing the offense, but as teachers or schools, so we also have a responsibility to prevent this. So child safety is a larger aspect, including all these aspects. As I mentioned earlier, safety of children in a school is also important. So it's not just about children. Some of you might remember a few incidences of, say, BPO employees, like women employee getting victimized with sexual assault while traveling on, say, office cab or office bus, etc. So there even office management is liable because it's all about ensuring safety of women employees. So similarly over here, it's also about ensuring safety of children who are actually traveling in the facility that we provide. As long as it is an outsourced service. So like, for example, children are coming by buses or vans, which we have nothing to do with it. My responsibility doesn't extend till then. But if I am giving contract to a travel agency to pick up and drop children, then my responsibility extends. So it's all about whether I'm taking any responsibility. So this whole thing is related to whether I was the one because of which that particular service was provided or not. So in fact, that's the reason why we had some of the guidelines coming by state government asking for schools to take care of safety in the buses, etc., because it just doesn't limit to classroom or campus, it goes beyond that. Despite all this, suppose an individual commits an offense. It can be, say, physically assaulting a child, any kind of offense. Suppose it's committed by an employee, maybe by a teacher or by a staff, anyone who's working in a school. That person who's committing that offense definitely is directly and personally liable. And in addition to that, the school may also be responsible. So let's see the extent of liability of the school or the employers or the management. Now here we should understand the difference between civil liability and criminal liability. As I said, criminal liability is about imprisoning, imposing fine, or it's also about, say, maximum punishment is death sentence for severe offenses like murder and all. So that's about criminal liability. Now, when it comes to imprisonment, for an act I have done, why should my management be punishable? Why should the person who is running the management of the school be subjected to imprisonment? So when it comes to criminal liability, only the one who has committed the offense will be liable. The other person generally is not liable unless the complainant is able to show that the other person, who is maybe the director, the manager, the principal, etc., also knew what was happening. Like, you need that state of mind, voluntarily doing, intentionally doing, knowingly doing. So which means generally in a criminal law, it is difficult to hold employer liable for the acts done by employees. So criminal liability is usually very difficult unless it's in a case where the management knew what teachers were doing, but they were not bothered to stop the teachers. So it's a very rare situation where others can be liable for what I have done. So this is called as vicarious liability in law. Vicarious liability means holding one responsible for the act done by another. So this usually will not apply in a criminal case unless both of them knew what they were doing. So I know that the teacher is assaulting child, I don't stop. So I as a principal can also be liable. So it all depends on how much of knowledge we share, that state of mind we share. So I'm deliberately not using legal terms. There are other alternative legal terms, but if you're understanding what I'm saying, it should be fine. So that's about vicarious liability under criminal law. Under civil law, we can hold employer also liable. If an employee commits an offense, apart from employer can also be subjected to civil liability, because civil cases means it's about compensation. So therefore, we can ask management also to pay compensation. Now, why are we holding management liable, employer liable? So it's because, in the industrial revolution time, during those times, people who are working, if at all committed some, say, accidents, etc., in factories, etc., so they were not in a position to compensate. So we're talking about laborers who are getting minimum wages and all. So to ensure that I, who has suffered, get damages, so this whole concept of vicarious liability came, which says that if in the course of employment, if an employee commits an offense, I can file a case against the employer first and get my compensation. Later, the employer will recover it from employer or not is left to that employer. But I don't have to go beyond this person who's unable to pay me any compensation, because this whole injury is caused to me by that person who was working and while working is committed this accident on me. So something like that. So therefore, in a civil law, even now, I can file a case on the school management and claim compensation from school management, because it's all about compensation, etc. So that is about vicarious liability. Then there is another principle in law called as strict liability. So which says that if I'm doing, this is also only applicable in a civil law. Generally, there are exceptions in criminal law, but this generally applies in civil law. If I'm doing anything which is very dangerous, which we all know is dangerous, and because of that risk involved, dangerousness involved, somebody gets injured, then there is a case filed against me. I cannot say, no, I didn't know, I didn't intend and all that. So I'm strictly liable because whatever I had done itself involved some risk. For example, maybe there's a construction activity going on in school. Maybe I'm constructing a swimming pool, etc. Or the swimming pool is unattended, like left unattended, etc. We are not even checking who is going near the pool, etc. Child dies, gets injured, etc. In those cases, I can't say, no, I didn't know. So that is where the law says, no, you're handling like something which is very risky, so you're supposed to be liable. So that's why that, being more careful and all becomes extremely important. These may be the examples relating to swimming pool or employer-employee, but the same principle can get extended to institutions like educational institutions. This is in brief about some of the legal aspects which will apply when it comes to child safety, which is an extremely crucial aspect. To ensure that the child is safe, it's a collective responsibility of everyone, starting from the school management, the state, in fact, then the school management, all those involved in administration, coming to the child's teacher, who is in fact the first point of contact for a child. So it's like everyone who's running the affairs in the school who are supposed to be contributing towards safety of children. Most importantly, in the initial part of my presentation, I said, we don't discriminate legally between parents and teachers for certain aspects because we see teachers as being in place of parents. So this is called as, it's a maxim. It's a Latin maxim. So it says teachers are in place of parents because it's called in loco parentis. So teachers are in the place of parents, which means suppose it's an emergency situation, maybe I have to immediately take a decision. At least now you have phone calls and all, you can call up parents and all. Now let's assume I'm unable to contact parents. I have to take some decision in favor of the child. Maybe the child has fallen. I have to immediately take to the doctor. I can't keep waiting for the parents to give consent to me. I immediately take the child to the doctor, to the nearest hospital. So these are generally considered to be what's been done in good faith because after all, we are in the place of loco parentis, that is in place of parents. Coincidentally, today is World Day Against Child Labor. In fact, one of the hindrances for ensuring that a child gets access to education has been child labor. Against this, there's been a lot of initiatives that has been taken internationally, nationally, as well as by government agencies, other institutions. And to ensure that child labor ends, we should ensure that child gets access to education. Somewhere both gets linked with each other because it's important to ensure that child learns. And to ensure that child learns, the atmosphere we provide a child in the school should be safe. In fact, there are a lot of reports which says that girls stop going to school in rural areas because they don't have proper toilet facilities. Or there are a lot of other issues that gets linked to safety, and then it leads to, say, denial of right to education. So therefore, safety is more than just ensuring physical safety. Indirectly, it's also about ensuring an end to child labor, ensuring access to education, ensuring that we are taking these children towards a happier future. Because if they're happy today, we all become happier tomorrow, as was quoted by a famous speaker. Our nation's children are our greatest asset and most precious treasure. To ensure that we treasure this precious future of ours, we should ensure that safety is considered as a paramount important aspect of schools. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very crisp and thought-provoking presentation. Now the session is open for queries. You can raise your hands. We will unmute you, those who have queries. Participants who have queries, kindly raise your hand. We will unmute you. You can ask the question to ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
There is Dr. Padmanabhan. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You
yes,
can.
Dr. Nagaratna, ma'am, and good evening very much. It was an awesome, excellent content delivery, and you have highlighted us completely about the safety of the child as well as the safety of the management, staff, and everything. Hats off to your delivery. Though no doubt we are not, expert into the law and all, but you have given us the insight. And one of our school student is also your student. Okay. Fine, keeping that aside. And my question is, there are certain times where there would have not happened any mistake in the school, but the child presumes itself that this has happened to me and they did something to me in the toilet. We had experiences in the school. The child goes home and then says that they have removed my undergarment and somebody started putting hand on my private parts, and I got scared. I started crying off, and then I came home, but I couldn't tell anybody. And then the parent comes and makes off a huge tantrums. But how do we do this? Because there is no camera there. There's nobody to go and give any evidences there. But in such cases, how do we react to it, and what should do, man?
Yeah, I understand it's a very sensitive issue, a little difficult also if you see it from the management perspective. But the approach we've taken since 2012, especially through POCSO and then later on changes made to JJI, large extent, especially POCSO, it's more towards, say, ensuring that the interest of the child is taken care of. So coming to the legal aspects, so it's a psychological issue. All those are different aspects, so I'll not get into that. So legally, what child says generally is presumed to be true. So but that doesn't mean that we blindly have to trust it and punish the offender and all under the law. So of course, everything is subject to inquiry and all. So if it is a lie by a child, it's very difficult to say sort it out. You have to see it more as I said, a psychological issue and all. If it is, say, a frivolous complaint, a false complaint made by parents, so those are also some of the incidences that gets often reported. So if you're very clear that the complaint by the parent was wrong, they're trying to misuse laws like POCSO, we have punishments imposed under POCSO. But for something that the child assumes or not assumes, lies or genuinely believes it to be true, it's a very difficult aspect. But anyways, when it comes to, say, punishing the offender, of course, inquiry should be done. If it is a criminal case, you should throw it beyond reasonable doubt, generally, except under POCSO. But there also you need some evidence to punish someone. If the civil offense also, the burden is on both the parties. So where the one who's filing a case against me should also prove I have done this civil wrong. I should prove, no, I have not done. So everything can't just be simply taken on just one statement of the child. So it requires corroboration of evidences. Extent of evidence you require under criminal and civil law is different, but it requires thorough investigation, inquiry and all. But apart from this, the frivolous complaints by elders is subject to, say, punishment under POCSO. By children, we excuse the child because all these laws are meant more to be in the interest of children, good or bad, but it's supposed to be like that.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Padmanabha, for the query. And now we have Mr. Joyce
Thank you, ma'am.
James.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Joyce James, kindly unmute and raise the query.
Thank you, madam, for your very comprehensive presentation regarding the laws pertaining to children. You have mentioned that POCSO is a very serious, comprehensive and strict act, but the conviction rate is very low as 20%. What would be the reason for that, for this? Because this law has been enacted and we were very hopeful that the child protection will take place, but unfortunately it's not happening. What is your take on that?
So like most of the laws in India, POCSO also, yes, the extent of convictions are less, like many other criminal laws. So it can be not just because of specific issue involved under POCSO. It's like generally, like in our country, most of the witnesses turn hostile. Maybe it's a genuine case, parents suddenly turn hostile. They don't want to further proceed. Or like maybe there's a bad investigation by police. I'm not saying this happens in every case, but most of the cases, maybe they've collected evidence, but they've not collected it properly. So like that, for example, in one case, which came in 2000, which happened in 2013, but the case happened little before 2013, but the matter came before Supreme Court in 2013. It's called Venkateshwara versus State. So in this case, there was a rape committed by a constable on a child who was unable to speak, dumb and deaf child. So, and it was committed in front of other children. They were eyewitnesses. So other children who were witnesses had explained it, about that whole issue to the police. The problem was police record the statement and the police just close the case on brief investigation done. When the matter goes to the court, so you can't trust witness statements recorded by police. It should be recorded by court. I'm not saying that there is a problem with what children have said, but the manner in which investigation was done was bad. Immediately, cloth of victim, cloth of accused should have been confiscated, sent to forensic examination. So it's a larger issue. So the manner in which investigation is done was bad. So Supreme Court in 2013 says that our hands are tied. We know he's done the offense, but the quality of investigation evidence is such that we can't punish him. And throughout the trial, this child was only crying instead of saying anything. So that is on the other hand. So while the previous question says how it can be, process can be abused, this question is about like, it's a genuine case, but then if you do not have proper evidence, what can law also do? So coming back to say offenses under POCSO, number of convictions in a country like India is still bad because many times, they don't want to file a case. It's about like, social seclusion and all that. Parents do not want to undergo that humiliation, further victimization of children and all. So if even the mother comes up, files a case, we know how people see it doubtfully. A lot of things we keep hearing from reports and all. So many times they don't come ahead filing a case. Even if they file a case, the manner in which investigation done is doubtworthy. So all these are the actual reasons. But still, sir, compared to all other laws, number of people who have been arrested are more under POCSO. So like last December, when as a part of my work, when I visited Bangalore Central Jail, maximum people who were there, who are under trial prisoners, who are still undergoing trial, final decision has not come, were arrested under POCSO. So it's that, it has bigger the seriousness of the offense effect, you can see, through this way. But, maybe the outcome of the trial, it's very difficult. So we have cases like Salman Khan's hit and run case where we all knew what was the actual case and we could still not punish because eyewitnesses turn hostile and all. So unfortunately, it's all about many other issues.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Joyce, for the query. Due to constraint of...
Yeah, ma'am, just one word about Father Joyce James is the child rights activist, Jesuit priest, is the secretary of the Jesuit South Asian Higher Education. Father, thank you that you are part of this, and we appreciate and we acknowledge your presence, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am, due to the constraint of time, we will take one last query which is put up in the chat. That is, if as a teacher, if a student is irregular to the class and running short of attendance, and if he or she is doing some misbehavior, and as a teacher, I punishes the student and the child goes on and takes his or her life, how far the teacher liable for that act?
Right. So that's where I focus a bit more on abatement. See, abatement becomes a crime provided whatever I've done should amount to abatement. And what is abatement? I should intentionally or knowingly do an act, intentionally knowing that, the consequence of my act is death of that person, is going to commit suicide, which is very blur in these kind of situations. So therefore, a teacher will not be definitely held liable. So it's not just about this. We've had cases of like where, say, government employees or even in police department, people have committed suicide, naming their higher-ups and all. Higher-ups can't be liable for abatement. However worse I am as an employer, as a boss, whatever, you can't. So abatement is intentionally or knowingly abetting suicide, knowing that what I do will lead to his or her death. Best example, if a mother-in-law, usual example I give is this, a mother-in-law, maybe in a conservative background kind of a case, so tells that, in fact, this happened in a case that you're carrying an illegitimate child and I'm going to find another bride for my son. Then daughter-in-law goes and commits suicide. So Supreme Court says this is enough to abet the suicide of women. So like that, because whatever I said, carrying illegitimate child and all, especially we are talking about a case which happened in the 80s in a rural part of India. Court says this is abatement. So therefore, I should know the consequence. So as long as I do not intend to draw that person to the extent of committing suicide, it is not abatement. You may call it as same mental torture and all, but it cannot be abatement because abatement can only be with the intention of inciting or aiding or conspiring.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, on behalf of the organizing team, I would like to convey that there is a lot of appreciation for your presentation. Your presentation was very crisp and to the point, and even I'm a person from computer science. I could understand law so very well from your presentation. So you started from the fundamental duties, directive principles of the state policies, Juvenile Justice Act, detailing out the offenses under the IPC, exemptions under the criminal liability, POCSO, cyber safety of children, data protection. So today we are ever more convinced about how law ensures everybody's right. So on behalf of the entire Christo Jayanti fraternity, I extend to you, ma'am, our heartfelt gratitude. Thank you, ma'am. I thank all the participants for being so enthusiastic and being an active audience and active participation. Thank you very much. So the session has come to an end. We will take a very short break. You can just take a 1 or 2 minutes break, and we will come back and start the session sharp at 5:45. Thank you.
Thank you.